Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro, friends. On today's episode of the podcast, we start a new series. This week's series is Communication Strategies in the Coffee Industry. And specifically, we're going to talk about how do we communicate within the coffee industry. So throughout this week, we'll be covering a couple of topics: how you communicate as a leader, how you communicate as an employee, how you communicate online. We're going to talk about the media and how they communicate within the coffee industry. But before we get started, on a very important and finally happening note, I would like to confirm that our assertiveness workshop is finally available online and very topical right now because we're starting this week-long series on communication strategies. So if you head to mapitforward.org/webinars, you'll get access there to be able to grab tickets. Now, this week, tickets will be reduced from $99 to $49 as a launch promo. So if you have been excited about getting to this, please go ahead and do it. You don't need any social media platforms to get access to this course. It has a bunch of sessions with all of the coursework included in the classroom that it will be involved in. It's all really great. So we're doing it through Google Classroom, and everything you need is included in each of the different segments. So go ahead to mapitforward.org/webinars and you can grab your ticket to the communication training, assertiveness training for the hospitality industry. So if we're looking at how do we communicate within the coffee industry, it's an interesting subject to consider as we break that down into how we communicate. So what are the different ways that we communicate as an industry, and how effective is the way that we communicate within our industry? Before we deep dive into that, I guess we should look at what is the coffee industry, because the coffee industry, if you're in specialty coffee, you may actually be quite insulated from the greater coffee industry. And it's important for you as a coffee professional, whether you're working in the specialty coffee industry or the coffee industry at large, to be aware of the greater landscape of that, particularly when it comes to communication. The reason I say this is because I've been guilty of having my head very much in the specialty coffee world and not paying attention to the greater coffee industry at large. And over the last few years, as I've become more and more aware of the coffee price crisis and the issues that we're having with the supply chain, the more aware I've become about how the bigger players in this industry, the larger coffee industry, have more of an influence in determining the direction in the way that things go. Understanding the way that they communicate within the industry and to their customers, and the signals that they put out, are a really great way to keep your finger on the pulse about what's happening in coffee now and what is a potential to happen into the future. If you're looking at becoming a long-term coffee professional, or you are currently a coffee professional with a long-term career and intending on staying in the industry, this hasn't been on your radar, and it's very easy for that to be the case if you're in specialty, or if you're in commercial coffee and aren't aware of specialty. Being aware of the industry at large is important. On that, be aware of what your focus is with regards to not only the industry, but the different size businesses at play when you are looking at communication strategies as we move through these 5 episodes on communication strategies within the coffee industry. And the reason I say that, if you're in the puppy phase of your career in coffee, so the first few years, either in your current career or in the greater part of your career. So what I mean by that is, let's say you are new into the industry, that's one thing, but you may also be long-term in the industry or new into a new sector in the industry. So if you've been a barista for 10 years and then have decided to become a roaster, being aware of the scope that you're focusing on is incredibly important to keep you tempered with regards to what's going on. What do I mean by that? If your world exists of just the businesses that are roasting in your town, or just the businesses that are roasting in your country, let's say you're a coffee roaster or a roasting company, and that is the scope of the communication that you are paying attention to or communicating with, what happens with that is that you are missing the opportunity to be influenced and to be inspired by the things that are going on outside of that scope. And it leads to an unintentional ignorance, perhaps intentional, but unintentional ignorance of what else is going on outside of you. An important part of communication and a communication strategy is listening. And so having your scope super insular, whether it be at a very local level or at a national level, is listening to what the conversation is that's going on at the local level, the national level, and at a global level. How do we communicate as an industry? On a local level, that typically happens through the more in-person ways that that's done. Sure, it happens on social media, but the way it tends to happen locally, I live in San Diego, and I guess that if I want to commune with the local industry, the best way to do that would be to go to cuppings, to visit coffee shops, to make efforts to have meetings and social catch-ups with people that are in the industry locally. An important part of doing that is networking. But when you're networking, the way that you communicate should be ever evolving. And why I say that is because networking can be terribly hard for people. Looking at the way that you communicate socially versus the way that you communicate professionally is important. The assertiveness training that you could take will be incredibly helpful in helping you come out of your shell. It will be incredibly helpful in making sure that you're able to effectively communicate what you say and what you mean in social settings as much as in moments of conflict when it comes to work. That's important because the better you're able to network locally, the greater the communication channels that open up for you in order to progress and become more active in your local community. When we look at then going to the national level, typically the way that we communicate starts to involve things like the media and trade shows and social media. So why I categorize social media outside of the media is because what I'm including as the media is publications like Barista Magazine, Roast Magazine. What else is there that I think is notable? That's the SCA releases a newsletter, podcasts like this podcast, Keys to the Shop, the Coffee Podcast, Boss Barista. These are the kinds of things that encourage communication to start getting around a country. Now, that's not to say that doesn't go global, but nationally, it's an important conversation that happens through media. Trade shows are an important way, and I encourage you to go to them if you can. So trade shows in particular, things like Coffee Fest, SCA Expo, or whatever the expo that's happening in your local country. So in Australia, it's MICE. These kinds of things, when you go to them, when they're happening locally, encourage you to visit and connect with and communicate with people that are in your local, by local I mean national, scope. It's really important to understand why you should be doing this. When you first start going to these things, it's very intimidating. But going and learning how to communicate, and you will fuck up. I messed up a number of times when I started going to conferences and when I started going to expos and trade shows and things like that. Sometimes you're too eager and other times you're not eager enough. You can walk away feeling like an idiot. You can walk away feeling like you've wasted a bunch of time. It doesn't matter. What's important is that you start doing it. Why? Because you're an important part of a community. And if that community doesn't know who you are and why you're there and what you're doing, they're never going to pay attention to what you're doing. It's also important to go to things that are outside of whatever your scope is. So if you're in specialty coffee, heading to shows and food expos and things like that can push you outside of what you normally focus on will be really helpful. How effective do I think our communication strategy is within our industry? I guess it's as effective as it is. And I know that that's a real cop-out, but it just really depends on what your agenda is. And I personally think that we need more communication strategies in the industry. And what I mean by that is we need people who know how to have conversations, to start podcasts and to start blogs and things like that, but not from the perspective of, here, let me tell you what my opinion is. If you just want to share an opinion, get on somebody's podcast. Reach out and ask to be a guest on their podcast and have something important and interesting to say. But I don't think that we as an industry, because I think of the nature of our competitiveness as an industry, and I really do think that we are far too competitive, far more competitive than we need to be, but that is an opinion. It seems to be that what is really highlighted in the press right now, and perhaps it's just because it's the season, but year round, it seems to be what's important is who's competing and how they're competing and who's doing what with regards to competition. And that's easier to digest than the things that are going on at origin, than the things that are going on in the market here in your local area, and pushing the agenda of how you grow as a professional. They're not such fun things to hear about, and so people just want to focus on what's easier. That's been my observation of the way that people digest what's being talked about with regards to, I guess, the communication strategy of our industry. We need to get better, but we need to get better with regards to a bunch of stuff. And if you are somebody who is considering starting a blog, considering starting a podcast, considering being a part of the solution to the way that we communicate as an industry, a really intentional and great thing that you can do is think through the strategy of what role you're going to play in that and what it is that you want to communicate. I'm constantly trying to figure out ways that this podcast can be a better mechanism for communicating. But if you have any ideas, I would love to hear them. I'm a great listener and I am always open to hearing the ideas that people have for how we can improve the way that we exchange information and encourage discourse and idea swapping and elevating our industry. Don't forget, as we wrap up today's episode, don't forget to head to mapitforward.org/webinars. Jump on that assertiveness online training course. Have an amazing rest of your day, friends. Peace, love, and peanut butter.